Bryan Caplan, professor of economics at George Mason University. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast today. I don't know what I was doing, Googling something about housing policy, and your new book popped up. And I literally was like, oh, Bryan's got a graphic book on housing policy. I don't know when it came out. It must be pretty recently.
May 1st.
Immediately bought it. Loved reading it, really enjoyed it, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it. But like my first question is, who's the audience?
The audience is anyone curious about the world. I always start with, I am an academic, I'm a researcher. This has got to be something that people who devoted their lives' work to this topic find it not just accurate, but insightful. But then I just want to go down to as broad of an audience as I can. And for books like this, honestly, I can get kids who are 5 to go and read it. No, they're not understanding a lot of it. But when I was doing my first nonfiction graphic novel, my daughter was 5 and she was reading over my shoulder. And I think I got something here because I've never had my kids reading over my shoulder for anything else. So let's do it.
So this is a graphic novel about housing policy. It's called Build, Baby, Build. And how do you work with the graphic artist who is very skilled? Like, how do you write a script and then they come up with the graphic ideas, or how do you guys work to put this together?
So I'm a total control freak. And so even though I cannot actually draw myself, I don't just write a script. I do full storyboards where it has all of the narration and the dialogue. And then I use Google Images to get sample screenshots just to give the artist an idea of what I'm looking for. I play with the zoom and the camera angles and things like that. And then I give the artist the storyboards. And then the artist goes and does a draft. Normally I see the draft like, no, that's not what I wanted. We got to make it different. And I just keep iterating over and over until the artist makes it look the way that I want. When I'm lucky, and often I am, the artist does something better than what I asked for. I'm like, oh yeah, like, why didn't I do that? Nice. But then other times it's like, no, like, it's not what I wanted. You got to do it differently. Listen, read. Okay.
So you have a lot of actual people in here, past and present, actual economists mostly. Would you have to get their okay? Do they have to sign off on this?
No, I mean, normally it's considered fair use, and I haven't had any trouble with publishers in the past. My previous publisher was probably especially strict, but still they said there's no issue with drawing a living person and talking to them. It would basically mean that you couldn't draw a political cartoon either if we had a rule about that.
Have any of them reached out to you about how they're depicted in this book?
Let's see. Well, several of them knew it was going to happen. All the ones that have talked to me have been happy. It's possible that someone might object. Let's see. I don't think that I had any real people in this book that I was depicting negatively.
No.
But in my previous book, I did. But even there, I told the artist, like, don't go out of your way to make the people that are not my favorites look good. I'm not going for cheap shots here where because you disagree with me, you're ugly or something like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, so basically the premise is, and there are just a few things in the policy world that seem sort of obvious to me that are also hard to explain. And you do such a good job of explaining this, and especially the slippery slope portion where you think, in Missouri, to get after the low-income housing shortage, to the extent that there is one, they give tax credits to developers. The developers trade in tax credits. Oftentimes, housing doesn't even get built. I mean, it's just like a completely separate thing, and it doesn't really necessarily result in more housing. And at the same time, in our biggest cities like St. Louis, we just have a ton of abandoned buildings. So I feel like we absolutely have not gotten this right. But then I read a lot about like the San Franciscos, the Portlands, Los Angeles, with all the homeless problems and these ridiculous house prices. And so this is your attempt to explain this in simple terms. And what is going on with those situations I just described?
Well, the situation you described, there's probably even more going on, but the simple story that I have in the book is that housing is expensive because it's really hard to build housing. There's a normal way that markets work, which is that if demand goes up, prices rise, but that's a short-run effect. And because when prices go up, it means prices are above the actual cost of making the product, which is basically a giant bullhorn screaming to the business world, free money. You can make money just by producing the product in a normal way and selling it at the market price, and you get more money than it costs. So go ahead and do it. Then, anyway, normally this is how markets work.
Right.
But in the last 40 or 50 years, housing markets don't seem to have been working this way, especially in the places where the prices have gotten really high. And the question's why. This is not just me, but almost every researcher, regardless of their political views, who's gone and looked at the facts, comes away saying, of course, prices are staying high because it's almost impossible to get government permission to build much of anything there, which means supply is strangled. So prices stay high. This is really basic econ, that if you make something really scarce, then you make it expensive, which can be nice, at least if you're a seller, but for the rest of the world, it's a disaster.
Yeah, I remember when Portland did their green zone, they did a brown zone, green zone, and in the brown zone, the green zone, you couldn't build, if I remember correctly. But the brown zone, if you wanted to build, you had to knock something down. Of course, that's going to raise prices. Right.
Yeah, I mean, the way I say, like, a lot of people think this is some kind of weird ideology or philosophy. Like, it's the opposite. It's common sense. It's seeing some kids who have 10 gallons of lemonade and they can't sell it. And you say, hey, kid, don't charge $5 a glass.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, those are the big issues are regulation. I don't know if you read this or not. I don't want to catch you off guard, but the New York Times had an article today about a Swedish
it was
modular builder,
yes.
right? And literally could be quoting Bryan Caplan saying that the big difference between Sweden and the US is the amount of regulation of the housing industry. So we seemingly just can't get things built.
Yeah, I mean, like, the main thing to say about this, the modular homes, is that is a problem, but it's probably much less serious than the problem of not being able to get permission to build at all. I don't think that housing prices in Sweden are especially anything to celebrate. A way that an architect explained it to me when I was talking about the book is, Bryan, the kind of stuff that you're talking about roughly doubles prices, and the kind of stuff that I have to deal with raises them by another 20%. Things like needing to make really large fire escapes in a narrow skyscraper, with the result that you're losing a large share of the area of the building for a really tiny risk.
Yeah, and so, like, the main point is, like, I get a little nervous when people use the word panacea, but you use panacea a lot in this book, which is to say housing is sort of like an underpinning of so many of our other social ills. And if you can't afford housing, if you don't have a place to live, then it's going to create all of these other issues that, if we could figure out housing, could potentially be solved. Like what? Like, if we could figure out how to create enough housing that prices went down and it was reflective of the market, what else could be solved?
Well, let's just go down the list. I mean, poverty. Right? So so poverty is a necessity. That means poor people spend a larger share of their income on housing. If you could just get the price of housing down by a large amount, it's giving an especially large amount of help to people who are poor. Also, inequality. Anytime that you go and give a larger gain to the poor than to the rich, you have reduced inequality automatically. Social mobility. There used to be a really easy way for people to get a better standard of living for themselves in America, which is just pack up your car and drive to a higher wage part of the country, get a job there. It no longer works for low-skilled workers because while there are places in the US where wages are higher, in those places, housing generally is so much more expensive that you burn more than 100% of your raise on the housing. So what's the point of staying? I talk about environmental effects. It's crazy that California is trying to restrict construction, raising prices, all in the name of helping the earth. So, well, wait a second. Where do you think people are going to live if they don't live in California? They're going to live in a place with much higher energy costs because they don't have your nice weather. And it's really is like, well, we want California, we want the planet to be saved in California. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. Really, what you should want if you were a California Green would be to go and build so much housing that the population of California doubles. That would make a lot more sense.
Yeah, so I don't think sense is working into this a lot, right? I mean, I feel like people understand that the housing market is overregulated. I feel like anyone who's had to do a construction project or build.
Yeah, well, anyone who works in construction, they're familiar with this.
I mean,
but I don't think that most people do understand much of any of this. I would say actually that the typical person in America is totally clueless about the whole idea of how housing markets work. And in the book, I actually go over this one paper where I think it's in the references, and I talk about the general idea that you just ask people what would happen to housing prices if you approved a lot more housing. And about a third of people give the correct answer, which is the prices go down. About a third say they stay the same. About a third say they go up. So if people are this confused about the most basic relationship between the abundance of housing and its price, it's going to be really hard to sell them on much of anything. I wish
Yeah.
you were right that this was widely accepted. I say it's widely accepted among people who know anything,
Right.
but not that many people know anything.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a big component to that is I live in a sort of rural area, and our county government has designated sort of like growth areas and non-growth areas. And it really gets people hot and bothered because they're going to take single family zoned areas and they're going to allow them to have multifamily. And next thing you know, there's going to be apartment buildings and the whole town's going to be ruined, right? It's going to be
Next thing you know, in 1,000 years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you could even get them built. But people are really against the idea of high density or medium density building, as we all know, in their backyard. I mean, people just don't like it. They don't want you to change the skyline, right? They just don't want it.
Yes, and even in cases where you're living in a rural area, people might get worked up over skyline. Like, what skyline are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's like nothing. But in the book, I say like a lot of this is just sheer paranoia. You mention relaxing regulation, and then people's minds just go to the most exaggerated, paranoid fears of the worst possible case scenario. It's like, I don't want to go and deregulate. I don't want to have a pig farm next to me. It's like, well, it's really unlikely. Really unlikely that anyone wants someone's going to build a pig farm in Beverly Hills. Like, why would they? It's not a reasonable use of the land. And on the other hand, the idea that you might be prevented from doing something totally reasonable because government just won't listen to common sense, that's an actual omnipresent feature of anyone who's trying to develop anything. What's so odd is the way there's so much hostility towards developers. There are people who provide our second most vital necessity. There isn't hatred against farmers.
Right.
I don't know anyone saying goddamn farmers trying to do their evil farming things. But with
you have them as fat cats, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But with developers, there's this sense of like they're just out there trying to make money by providing a basic necessity. And so I don't like them. Like
pave the planet. Yeah. I think that's right. Is there anywhere that's done this at all? There any like state or local area where where we've seen what can happen if you deregulate some of the housing policy?
What we've really seen is areas that just never had much regulation to begin with.
Okay.
Deregulation is hard because you pretty much need to convince people they made a mistake. But there's plenty of areas where the regulation just is much milder. So Houston is the most famous example in the US, but the whole state of Texas is pretty good. There's some exceptions, but there's a reason why Texas can have millions of new people moving to it in a decade. Millions of people aren't going to move to live on the streets. They're moving because there's a reasonably priced home that they can get in a nice area. I think that's also important. I've argued with people saying, well, if you go to the middle of nowhere, California, go out to the desert, it's cheap. Yeah, we want to have cheap housing in places people actually want to live. Cheap housing in places that nobody wants to live. What good is that? So you've got to combine it.
And yet people move to New York City. I have a niece who moved out of college. I don't know how she pulled it off even, you know what I mean? Moved to New York City and loves it. But it is, to me, not unsustainable to live at the cost of living in that town. San Francisco.
Like if you're willing to sacrifice everything else, of course, a lot of what people sacrifice is just having children, which I discuss in the book as well. There's a bit of research here, but I think the really simple point is this. One of the main reasons people keep living with their parents is because the cost of housing is too high.
Right.
If you're living with their parents, you're not very likely to get married and you're even less likely to have kids. So if we could just go and make even apartments affordable, it is likely that this would have beneficial effects for fertility, which, as you may have heard, is getting to frighteningly low levels. To the point where it's like, what is the future of humanity here? Are we just going to disappear in 200 years?
I guess that's what I've heard. 2080, I think, is some sort of a turning point. Yeah, we do have declining birth rates, and that's exactly right. And I know a lot of people in the millennial Gen Z generation who just feel like they can't afford to start a family, and that is their biggest,
right.
I'm in.
there's something exaggerated about it because things were like, the actual affordability of housing in some sense was even worse in the 50s just because people were so much poorer. They were
Yeah,
spending a smaller share, but the places they were living in would be ones where people would say, well, I can't possibly live there.
that's right.
You could, again, you can imagine going and just getting people's expectations down to rock bottom. And then they say, fine, I don't mind having 5 kids in an apartment. I don't think that's very realistic, but much more realistic is to build so much housing that people say, okay, now it's good enough. Now it's a
Yeah, you
situation.
certainly talk about density and going up, right?
Mhm,
In places
mhm,
like San Francisco, there
mhm,
could be more
mhm.
higher
Right.
buildings.
I mean, so I've been arguing with people about this because there's many people worried density is reducing fertility. And like, well, there's a lot of measures of density. How about we just have the measure of square feet of housing per person? There is no technological reason why people could not have large places to live in San Francisco and Manhattan. To imagine a world where we have 10 times as many skyscrapers, price of housing is a quarter of what it is. And one of the things people will do is say, yeah, I don't want to live in a small apartment in Manhattan. I want to live in a big apartment in Manhattan, one with soundproof walls so the baby doesn't wake up the neighbors or me if I'm
Right.
trying to get the kid to learn how to sleep through the night, that kind of thing.
That just means more big buildings.
Yeah, so build it tall, and this means that you can have a vast number of people enjoying prime locations in comfort.
Right. I do like the whole slippery slope thing and the thing that you just talked about, how we never go backwards on regulation because you have to admit you made a mistake. I do see that as being a little bit depressing because I don't see how we ever get ourselves out of this. I feel like the building code only gets bigger and
Mm-hmm.
permits only get harder. And getting the inspection and passing it is only getting worse. So,
I mean, so there is some progress going on. You've got California, Oregon, and Minnesota putting big limits on single family zoning. And then over in Florida, they've had this new state rule saying that local governments have to go and either approve your project or explain what the issue is in a very short amount of time.
oh, nice.
So it's like if you get behind in your paperwork, then people have automatic approval, which
Oh, wow.
is a pretty strong incentive to get on the ball one way or the other. And probably big part of it is just like, okay, we just don't have the time to turn them down. Just start approving things, which if you are, again, paranoid, your mind will be saying, well, they're going to be allowing people to build skyscrapers that fall over and kill 1 million people, but not a reasonable forecast for what's going to happen. The main
Right. And
thing
that's something that came out of this article I was reading, which is like, we could just say it has to meet this requirement without saying how it has to be done. Like
sure.
we could loosen that up and let people get innovative and
Yes.
find lower cost options.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
find,
economists have been saying this thing for ages. They've been saying
Yeah.
it for pollution. How about stop telling people what pollution abatement technology they have to use and just say, like, this is the amount you can do. If you want to pay more, you got to pay something, and now do whatever you want. But this is not something that is easy to go and sell in a debate. So you just want to let people do anything they want as long as they pay for it. Like, well, the price is going to be substantial. It's not that you're going to be choking. It's just that we're getting pollution cleanup on the cheap. Still a very hard sell. But you're right. Like it is depressing when you just think about how bad things have gotten. And I think you have to be fairly dogmatic to say one book is going to change the way everybody sees it. I'm just one person. I just try to go and explain it as well as I can. I hope.
I don't know. I had it on my kitchen counter over the weekend and my whole family talked about it.
Very good.
We were just all, one of my Gen Z kids was like, you can't fight NIMBYism. Like he's like, it's the ultimate NIMBY problem, right? Where people might understand that it makes sense to do multifamily or do apartment buildings. They just don't want them in their single family neighborhoods at all. Right. So what do you do about that?
Yeah, so I say a lot of it is just realizing the problem is not just homeowners. It's also renters. It's not self-interest. If it were, it would be easier, actually, because if we're self-interest, you would just say, hey, here's a bag of money to get your signature on this page. Now let me go. Right? Or you could say, all right, here's the deal. We get rid of all property taxes for existing homeowners for 10 years. And in exchange, the new buildings have triple property taxes to go and pay for everything. And you get what you want. We get what we want. Let's move ahead. The problem really is more that support for regulation. It's philosophical. Yeah. It's based upon a whole worldview about how things work, which comes down to market's bad, disasters likely, and you can't change my mind. So another big part of it is like, I'm not negotiable. We're not going to bargain about this. So
Right.
that's the real problem. It's just this economic illiteracy, this paranoia. Yeah, and also, as I say, innumeracy, just not being willing to look at numbers because there's a lot of complaints about development that are true. They're just small. And
Yeah.
if you put a number on them, you'd say, all right, fine, suppose you're right about this bird nest, but is this $1 million bird nest? You know how many bird nests get disrupted every day? Like, what are
Right.
we going to go and stop an entire development over these birds? Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, maybe this is like part of the effort to at least improve economic literacy, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that is
Mm-hmm.
that's an area where there's a lot of work to be done right now in this country.
Yeah.
So even if you can
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine said that one thing that I'm doing in these graphic novels is I'm teaching basic econ alongside the issue, and I felt really good about that. Like
Right.
someone noticed.
That's right.
Yes, I'm trying to give people the idea of think about benefits as well as costs. Don't just go to the meeting, hear a bunch of people complaining and saying, "Well, I guess we can't do it." Well, let's hear from about all the good things that are going to happen. And when you yourself are deciding, do I want a development to happen? Don't just say, I don't want to have my view obstructed. All right, fine. You don't like your view changed, or you don't want to have the traffic or the noise. But what about the new family that moves in is or will be the parents of your kid's new best friend? Is that possible? Wouldn't it be nice to have your kid's best friend be within walking distance? That is a realistic possibility that will almost never be brought up in any kind of planning meeting or anything else because they're so focused on being negative.
Yeah, and then shoving some of the infrastructure upgrades off to developers and making them do parking lots and making them do,
Mm-hmm.
intersections now and making them contribute
Mm-hmm.
to the school, like trying to offload some of those things
Yep.
too, which I think people do worry that if you let a new neighborhood or a new apartment building,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to have all of these infrastructure requirements that come with it.
Right. I mean, there's something weird about trying to keep out new development because you don't want their kids to go to school. It's like, well, you start off by having free public school because you're worried about poor kids. And then as a result, you say that poor kids can't live in your area.
That's
Like,
right.
make up your mind. So do you want to help them or not?
That's right. And a lot of people do move in and then want to close the gate, right? They're like,
Mm-hmm.
well, I moved here, but now I'd like to
Mm-hmm.
close the gate to more
Mm-hmm.
people moving here, which
Yep.
I've seen
Yeah,
that
I mean,
across the
again,
whole
like
country.
those people, I feel like you could deal with them. It's like, okay, it's just about money. All right, fine. Let's talk money.
Yeah.
What's hard is when someone just says it's the principle of the matter. It's wrong to allow this development. It's
Right.
like, what am I going to do with this person?
Right.
It's wrong to tear down one of 10,000 Victorian homes. Like, who's going to miss it?
Oh yeah, historical commissions. Yes. Oh yeah. So that seems like a harder job to do a book like this than to just write a book. What do you think?
Well, in some ways, it's definitely harder, especially when you have to go and work with an artist. I can't draw myself, so I do
Yeah.
need to go and micromanage another person, and I'm a control freak. Fortunately, the artists I've worked with have always been good humored about my control freakery, so that's not too bad, and we have a good time. The main thing that I say is easier about a book like this is I have no writer's block when I do this book or books like this. When I'm doing books like this, there's a feeling of constant forward momentum where if I'm at a loss for the words, I can go and try changing the images or moving the words around or changing the zoom or redesigning the page. Maybe we need to have 5 panels here instead of 4. So in terms of the joy of working on the project, these books are always really fun for me. And I just have the sense, okay, I'm getting things done more and more and more. Keep going, keep going. It's great, going great. Whereas when I'm doing a regular university press book, I also still do those.
Yeah.
Then I often will have a sense, oh man, I squeezed out 1 paragraph today because I was
Same.
just so blocked. And yeah,
Do you have any more in the
I've got this
works?
weight on my shoulders because I have this idea, like, at
Yeah.
least according to me, this has to be the best book ever written on this topic. I
Yeah.
understand, no, maybe no one else in the world agrees, but if I can't believe that this is the best ever done, then who else will? And
That's
when
right.
you have that quality standard in mind, it's hard to write because you're about to do a sentence and that wouldn't be in the best book.
Yeah.
That sentence is very mediocre. No, it's not good enough. Right.
Well, I think about things forever and ever and ever. I just don't get them down on the page.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think them through, but I just have to stop, and I have a tendency to go into numbers. Do you have any more in the works? Are you going to do another one?
Yes, so definitely we'll do additional graphic novels. I don't know what I want the topic of the next one to be, but they're just too fun and fulfilling to not do more.
Do
And
you have one
plus,
on
my partner,
immigration?
oh yeah, I've got one on immigration, one on housing, and I'm weighing what else I might do. Right now, I'm working on a totally new University Press type book, not a graphic novel. It's called Unbeatable: The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. So that one is going pretty well. I'm feeling happy about the pace. The writer's block is tolerable anyway. So
That's
hopefully I
great.
could be submitting that to a publisher in under a year.
Well, that's great. I mean, I did really enjoy it. It does get all of the points across in a way that, a lot of people just don't
Mhm.
want to read academic papers or
Yeah.
books. It's just a
Who
fact.
does?
And so great way to
Yeah.
learn the whole thing. And I really enjoyed the pictures. I think the artist is great. So I
Great. Glad
really
to hear
appreciate
it.
it. And
Yeah, we were really going for classic Disney homage. So I said we really wanted to do, Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, to
yeah,
get all of these positive associations with these childhood movies that almost everybody has seen and loves.
yeah, it was great. Build, baby, build. Thank you so much for coming on to talk
Thank
to
you.
us about it. It was very enjoyable. And I look forward to seeing another one.